The streets of downtown Los Angeles buzzed with life. People hurried to their destinations, cars honked relentlessly, and towering buildings cast long shadows across the sidewalks. Among the chaos, a man sat quietly against a brick wall, wearing tattered clothes. His unkempt beard hid most of his face, and his old dirty hat was pulled low, obscuring his eyes. A small cardboard sign rested beside him, "Just trying to get back on my feet. Anything helps." As pedestrians passed by, most ignored him, some glanced sympathetically, while others scoffed or muttered under their breath. He didn't beg or plead. He simply sat still, his presence almost blending into the scenery. Every now and then, a child walking with their parents would glance back, curious, but they were pulled away quickly. Down the street, a sleek black sports car purred to a stop outside a luxury coffee shop. The driver, Richard Huxley, stepped out with his phone pressed to his ear. Richard was a wealthy businessman, handsome, sharply dressed, and oozing confidence. With his custom-tailored suit and expensive watch glinting in the sun, he looked every bit the success story. "Yeah, just close the deal," Richard barked into his phone as he strutted down the sidewalk. "I don't care what it costs. If they can't keep up, they don't deserve to play." He smirked as he hung up, proud of his ruthlessness. As Richard approached the coffee shop, he noticed the homeless man sitting nearby. Richard stopped and sneered, his expression filled with contempt. "Unbelievable," he muttered to himself before walking closer. "Hey," Richard's voice boomed, drawing the attention of nearby pedestrians. The homeless man looked up slowly, revealing kind eyes behind his shaggy appearance. "Yes," he said softly. Richard scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Sitting here begging while the rest of us actually work for a living. How pathetic." The homeless man remained calm. "I don't mean to bother anyone, sir. I'm just trying to." "Oh, please spare me the sob story," Richard cut him off, laughing cruelly. "You people make excuses for your failures while the rest of us hustle and succeed." A small group of bystanders began to gather, whispering among themselves. Parents clutched their children's hands tightly, uncomfortable with the scene. One little boy, no older than 7, tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mommy, why is that man being so mean?" he asked innocently. "Shh, honey," the mother said, pulling him back. The homeless man, unfazed, simply smiled faintly. "Sometimes life takes us places we don't expect. Kindness can change a lot more than words like yours." Richard laughed again, louder this time. "Kindness. That's rich coming from someone who can't even afford a sandwich. How about you get a job instead of sitting here embarrassing yourself?" The crowd grew quieter, uncomfortable with Richard's behavior, but no one dared step in. The homeless man's eyes flickered with a trace of sadness, though he didn't respond. Suddenly, a small voice broke the silence. "Excuse me, mister," said a little girl with curly blonde hair. She held out a crumpled dollar bill with her tiny hands, her big blue eyes full of compassion. "You can have this." Her mother tried to pull her back, but the homeless man smiled warmly and leaned forward to accept the dollar. "Thank you," he said gently. "You have a very kind heart." Richard rolled his eyes in disgust. Seriously, teaching kids to waste their money on someone like him. Unbelievable. The girl's mother frowned, holding her daughter protectively. "Maybe she has more kindness in her little finger than you have in your whole body," she snapped. The crowd murmured in agreement, and Richard's face turned red. He straightened his jacket and pointed at the homeless man one last time. "You'll never amount to anything," he hissed. "People like you don't belong in the same world as us." With that, Richard turned on his heel and walked into the coffee shop, leaving the homeless man in silence. The crowd slowly began to disperse, though their disapproval lingered in the air. The little girl looked back one last time, waving gently. "Bye, mister." The man smiled and waved back. "Take care, sweetheart." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the homeless man sat quietly once more, his mind calm despite the humiliation. Little did Richard know, he had just belittled Keanu Reeves. The evening sun began to cast a warm orange glow across the city skyline, and the streets grew quieter as the hustle of the day slowed. Keanu Reeves, still sitting against the brick wall in his disguised state, watched the people pass by. Despite the harsh words he'd endured earlier, his demeanor remained serene. Keanu had always been drawn to life's quiet corners, the overlooked, the misunderstood. A few feet away, the little girl who had given him a crumpled dollar tugged at her mother's hand again. "Mommy, can we check if the nice man is okay?" she asked softly. Her mother hesitated, glancing back at Keanu. Something about him had seemed different. There was a warmth in his voice and kindness in his eyes that most people who had lived on the streets for long periods didn't often carry. "Okay, sweetheart." But just for a moment she relented. The pair walked back to Keanu, and the little girl kneeled beside him, her eyes filled with curiosity. "Why are you sitting here all alone, mister? You look sad." Keanu smiled warmly, his voice gentle as he spoke. "I'm not sad, little one. Sometimes I just like to sit here and watch the world. It teaches me things." Her mother looked down, puzzled. "You don't sound like someone who belongs here," she said cautiously. Keanu chuckled softly, his face still obscured by the beard and hat. "Appearances can be deceiving, can't they?" Before the mother could respond, the doors of the luxury coffee shop swung open, and Richard Huxley strolled back out, holding a steaming cup of coffee. He noticed the little girl talking to the homeless man and sneered. "Oh, for crying out loud, you're still wasting time with him." The mother shot Richard an icy glare. "It's called compassion, something you might want to try sometime." Richard smirked arrogantly, sipping his coffee. "Compassion is for people who don't understand how the real world works. If you're not strong enough to survive, you lose. That's how life is." The comment visibly upset the little girl. "You're a mean man," she blurted out. Keanu gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay," he said softly, his gaze fixed on Richard now. "Sometimes people don't know what they're missing until life teaches them a lesson." Richard scoffed, looking around at the small crowd that had once again started to form, drawn to the commotion. "Oh, great. You're some kind of philosopher now, huh?" He laughed cruelly. "Here, I'll make your day, buddy." Reaching into his wallet, Richard pulled out a crisp $100 bill. With a mocking grin, he waved it in front of Keanu. "Here you go. Since you clearly need all the help you can get, go buy yourself something nice, maybe a job application." The small crowd gasped, shocked by the disrespect. Keanu's face remained calm as he reached out to accept the bill. He stared at it for a long moment before looking back up at Richard with steady eyes. "You think money is what makes you rich?" he asked quietly. Richard snorted, spreading his arms dramatically. "Of course it does. Look at me. I have everything: cars, penthouses, the works. Money is what separates the weak from the successful." Keanu sighed, tucking the bill into his worn coat pocket. "Sometimes it's the richest people who are the poorest on the inside." The crowd murmured in agreement, but Richard wasn't having it. He stepped closer, towering over Keanu. "You don't know anything about me. You're just another loser who's mad that he couldn't make it in life." Keanu smiled faintly, his calm demeanor completely throwing Richard off. "Life has a way of showing people what really matters," he said. "You might want to listen when it speaks." Before Richard could retort, a black SUV pulled up across the street, catching Keanu's attention. The door opened, and a man in a suit stepped out, scanning the crowd before locking eyes with Keanu. "Sir," the man called, walking over quickly. The crowd turned to look, curiosity piqued. Keanu stood up slowly, stretching his legs as the suited man approached. "Everything okay, sir?" the man asked respectfully, completely ignoring Richard and the others. Richard blinked, confused. "Wait, what's going on here?" Keanu dusted himself off and, with a small smile, reached up to remove his hat. As he did, the crowd gasped collectively. Underneath the scruffy disguise was the unmistakable face of Keanu Reeves. Richard's face went pale as recognition dawned on him. No way," he stammered. The little girl beamed, tugging at her mother's hand. "Mommy, it's the nice man from the movies." Keanu turned toward Richard, his expression kind yet firm. "It's easy to judge someone by their appearance, isn't it? But everyone has a story, one you might not see at first glance." Richard opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. The crowd began whispering excitedly, their phones coming out to snap photos and videos of the surprising revelation. Keanu reached into his coat, pulled out the $100 bill Richard had mockingly handed him, and held it out. "Here," he said, his tone soft but deliberate. "Maybe you can use this to buy a little humility." Richard stood frozen, humiliated and speechless as the crowd erupted in applause. Keanu turned back to the little girl and knelt beside her. "Thank you for being kind when others weren't," he said warmly. "The world needs more people like you." The little girl grinned. and her mother wiped a tear from her eye, touched by the moment. Keanu stood, gave the crowd a small wave, and headed toward the black SUV, leaving Richard alone to wrestle with the weight of his actions. Richard Huxley stood frozen in place, his face pale and damp with embarrassment. The applause and chatter of the small crowd echoed in his ears, each laugh and murmur piercing his ego like 1,000 needles. People were taking videos and photos of his humiliation, their phones pointed at him like spotlights that revealed the ugliness of his actions. The weight of what had just happened hit him like a punch to the gut. He had insulted and mocked Keanu Reeves, one of the most beloved stars in the world, and the crowd knew it. "Isn't that the guy who owns Huxley Enterprises?" someone whispered. "Yeah, that's him. Rich jerk, right? Can you believe he acted like that?" another added. The small murmurs grew louder. Richard looked around nervously, his arrogance cracking as he realized the damage his actions might have on his reputation. Huxley Enterprises was his pride and joy, a billion-dollar empire he had inherited from his father. To the public, he had carefully crafted the image of a successful, benevolent businessman. But now, in this moment, his true colors had been laid bare for the world to see. One older woman in the crowd shook her head, glaring at him. "Shame on you. Money doesn't make you better than anyone." Richard tried to respond, to defend himself, but no words came. His throat was dry, and his mind raced. What have I done? Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves was climbing into the black SUV. The suited assistant who had fetched him opened the door respectfully. Keanu paused for a moment before getting in, his calm eyes sweeping back toward Richard and the crowd. He wasn't angry. There was no malice in his gaze. Instead, there was something far more powerful: disappointment. Keanu took one last look at Richard and said softly, "It's never too late to change who you are." With that, he stepped into the SUV, and the vehicle pulled away, leaving behind a humbled crowd and a shaken Richard Huxley. As the crowd began to disperse, Richard walked briskly away from the scene, his hands trembling. He ignored the stares and whispers that followed him, his face flushed with humiliation. Pulling out his phone, he immediately began to check social media. His worst fears were confirmed. Videos of the incident were already being shared, and comments were flooding in. "Rich guy mocks homeless man. Turns out to be Keanu Reeves." This is the definition of karma. Watch this. Huxley Enterprises, I'm never supporting that business again. Richard's chest tightened as he read the scathing comments. His brand, his reputation, everything he had worked to build was being torn apart in real time. He shoved the phone back into his pocket, breathing heavily as he tried to process what had happened. That night, Richard sat alone in his luxurious penthouse apartment. The lights of the city twinkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but their beauty brought him no comfort. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications, calls from his PR team, texts from business associates, and relentless updates about his public downfall. Unable to take it anymore, Richard turned off the phone and sank onto his leather couch. He poured himself a drink, his hand shaking slightly as he brought the glass to his lips. For the first time in years, he felt small. All his money, power, and influence, none of it had protected him from the truth being revealed. Deep down, he was a broken man, lacking the most valuable wealth of all: kindness and compassion. Richard's thoughts wandered back to the little girl at the coffee shop, her small act of giving a crumpled dollar to Keanu, someone she thought was homeless, replayed in his mind over and over again. Why had she done that? He realized that the child had nothing to gain from her act of generosity, yet she still gave. The words Keanu had spoken lingered like an echo in his empty apartment. Intermission. Sometimes it's the richest people who are the poorest on the inside, Benton said. It's never too late to change who you are. Richard sat in silence for a long time, staring into his drink as the weight of his life choices pressed down on him. The next morning, a surprising scene unfolded outside the same coffee shop. Keanu Reeves' assistant returned to the corner where Keanu had sat the day before. This time, he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by a small team, carrying boxes of food, bottled water, blankets, and envelopes. The crowd gathered again, curious as the team began distributing supplies to the homeless individuals nearby. Each envelope contained a note with a simple message: "You are seen, you are valued, keep going." Watching from across the street was Richard. He had returned to the scene, dressed far more humbly than the day before. Gone was the expensive suit, replaced by jeans and a simple jacket. He watched quietly as Keanu's team offered help without judgment, their kindness spreading like ripples in water. Richard turned his gaze to the bench where Keanu had sat, then looked down at the $100 bill still crumpled in his hand. He had kept it as a painful reminder. But now, for the first time, he knew what to do. Richard approached the man sitting quietly by the gas station, clearly down on his luck. With hesitant steps, he knelt beside him and offered the bill. "Here," he said, softly. "I hope this helps." The man looked up, surprised. Richard gave a small smile, standing up and walking away before the man could even say thank you. For the first time in years, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. As he turned the corner, he whispered to himself, "It's never too late." The floors were hot, the chairs graveled, so he whispered to himself. Days turned into weeks, and the viral video of Richard's humiliation at the coffee shop continued to spread like wildfire. News outlets picked up the story, and social media was ablaze with outrage. Richard Huxley's name became synonymous with privilege, arrogance, and cruelty. Huxley Enterprises saw a dip in its stock price, and business partners began pulling out of deals. Richard's empire, once untouchable, was crumbling before his very eyes. For a time, Richard disappeared from the public view. He shut himself away in his penthouse, avoiding phone calls, emails, and even his closest friends. But in the quiet, something remarkable began to happen. He started to reflect. He thought about Keanu Reeves' words, the generosity of the little girl, and the quiet dignity of the people society so often overlooked. It wasn't easy to admit his faults, but Richard finally realized the truth. He had built his life around the wrong values. Money and power had hardened him, blinding him to the simple joys of kindness, humility, and connection. The man he had become was not the man he wanted to be. One crisp morning, Richard stood at the very same coffee shop corner where everything had unraveled weeks earlier. This time, there were no designer suits or expensive watches. He wore a plain jacket and carried a box of supplies, food, clothes, and envelopes, mirroring Keanu's quiet acts of kindness. First, the homeless individuals looked at him warily, recognizing him as the man who had mocked Keanu, but instead of arrogance, they now saw something new in his eyes: sincerity. Richard knelt and handed out food, offering quiet words of encouragement. To one older man, he handed a warm coat. To another, he gave bottled water and a sandwich. And to a young mother struggling with a child in her arms, he handed her an envelope. Inside was a note: "You are seen, You are valued. Keep going. Hi, and welcome to. Tears welled up in the mother's eyes. Thank you, she whispered, her voice trembling. Richard gave a small smile, his heart feeling lighter than it had in years. As he continued, the small crowd watching from nearby began to soften. People whispered in surprise. Is that really Richard Huxley? Someone murmured. He's helping, another said. Maybe he's changed. That afternoon, Keanu Reeves returned to the same corner, this time without the disguise. Dressed in his usual casual way, he walked quietly among the people Richard had helped, exchanging kind words and warm smiles. When he spotted Richard, he paused, watching the man from a distance with a look of approval. Richard, unaware of Keanu's presence, knelt to tie the shoelaces of a young boy who was running barefoot. The boy grinned as Richard handed him a pair of sneakers from his box. For the first time in his life, Richard felt no need for applause, recognition, or status. He was simply giving, and it filled him with a joy he had never been. Keanu finally approached, clapping Richard lightly on the shoulder. Richard turned, his eyes widening in surprise. Mr. Reeves, he stammered. Keanu smiled softly. It's just Keanu, he said. Looks like you found your way. Richard nodded, a genuine smile crossing his face. I had a lot to learn, but I think I'm finally starting to understand. Keanu looked out at the crowd, many of whom were now helping one another, sharing food, offering clothes, and spreading warmth. Sometimes, it only takes one person to start a ripple of change, Keanu said. The world needs more of that. Richard felt a lump form in his throat, realizing how true those words were. He extended his hand to Keanu. Thank you, he said quietly. Keanu shook his hand firmly. Keep going, Richard. The world can always use more good. Months later, Richard Huxley made headlines again, not for scandal, but for his transformation. He launched a new foundation, the Ripple Project, dedicated to helping the homeless and those in need. Huxley Enterprises pledged millions to shelters, food banks, and programs that provided jobs and education to underprivileged communities. When asked by reporters why he had changed so drastically, Richard replied with a simple smile. Sometimes it takes a stranger to show you the person you should have been all along. At the launch of his foundation, a familiar face appeared in the crowd. Keanu Reeves, watching quietly, his trademark calm smile beaming with pride. Name one creator, Keanu whispered, jerking his finger toward the middle. Dane O'Reilly. The ripple had begun, and the world was already a better place because of it.